Make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
But to reclaim patriotism, which is different than nationalism, right? Like this nationalism says my country is the best above all the rest, and we should act and be treated as such. Patriotism says this is my home. I have affection for my home. But also that affection means I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to tell the truth about it because I love it. Not because I don't, but because I love it and I want it to be better. And so it's a chance for us to reclaim that kind of patriotism. Why should the U.S. flag these days symbolize far-right authoritarianism? That is not something that should be a universal, right? Like they take the flag and co-opt it to mean what they want it to mean. What if we take the flag and reclaim it for democracy? And, what's funny is Black people have always recognized the shortcomings of this nation and have always fought to make it better. So we go back to the Declaration of Independence and the phrases from there. I really like the preamble of the Constitution, where it says, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. I think those two phrases, we the people and more perfect union, are the ball game. That's what we need to reclaim at the 250th. We the people, that's what democracy means. Demos means people. Kratos means power. It's people power. The people need to reclaim their power. Why? In order to form a more perfect union. That is aspirational language. That says we're not there. And we never will be there. We will never arrive as a nation that is perfectly equal and democratic. But we are always striving to form a more perfect union. And that's what the vision should be. That's what people who care about democracy and their neighbors should be saying. Is like, we can become a better version of what this thing is supposed to be. And I'm going to take up the charge in my generation, in my community, and do my part to form a more perfect union because I'm part of we the people.
Hey, welcome back to our special Faithful Politics series, Church and State, 250 plus years of faith in America. I'm your political host, Will Wright. And if you haven't been following along, throughout this series, we've been tracing how religion shaped American life long before the United States existed and how Christian ideas, institutions, and leaders actually helped form what we know as America today. And today we are speaking with Jemar Tisby, Dr. Jemar Tisby, to help us add on to a part of the history. If you are not aware of who Jemar Tisby is, shame on you. But he is a historian and author and public scholar whose work sits right in the center of that story. He's the author of several books, to include The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism, How to Fight Racism, and The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance, and is also the founder of Tisby Studios and executive producer of the documentary Jesus Was a Migrant. And we're just so happy to have Jemar back on the show. Welcome to Faithful Politics again, Jemar.
Happy to be here. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. Well, so like I said at the top, we are starting this entire series on the premise that religion had an oversized impact on American history. And I love having you here because you are one of very few Black theologians that operate in this space. So I'd love to just hear from you, like, what in the telling of the story of 250 years of America, where does race enter that story?
It's a great question because we can reframe it and say race never has to enter the story because it's always been in the story. From the very beginning, both race and religion have been present. So right now we are dealing with a crisis regarding voting rights. Well, that's not new. That's not a 21st century thing. You can go all the way back to the Declaration of Independence, the question of who actually belongs when you're talking about that phrase, all men are created equal, entitled to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Who is the all in all, because it certainly didn't include Black people, but it also didn't include indigenous people, women, all kinds of people, basically, except white wealthy men. And there's a lot of people who are trying to bring that back today. You can also go to the U.S. Constitution and looking at the 3/5 compromise, right? So right now, pursuant to the voting rights crisis, they're redrawing congressional maps. They're redrawing districts in states. Why? It's about representation in Congress. So was the 3/5 clause. And 3/5 was about how do you count enslaved people. So the North said, well, you're enslaving them and you're treating them as property. They don't count at all when it comes to the population of a state for the purpose of determining how many representatives they get. But the South was like, oh, no, no, no. For the purposes of representation, they're people so that we get more power. But the compromise was they wouldn't be zero, they wouldn't be full, they would be 3/5. And on and on and on. We can look at different court cases, different waves of the Black freedom struggle. All of it is pointing to the fact that race has been integral to the nation's founding.
Yeah, there seems to be a theme, especially amongst Christian nationalists, that want to, try to paint America as some sort of Christian nation. The attachment to the Christian nation part varies, kind of depending on the group, on whether or not the country was founded as a Christian nation, or if the country should remain or stay, and efforts should be taken to make it more so a Christian nation. And I've always been confused about that, because knowing the history of America and then saying that it's Christian, I mean, this is probably either going to be a terrible or a perfect analogy, but it's like calling Donald Trump a Christian, because the actions, behavior, all the things that are generally associated with sort of like the Ned Flanders type of Christian that most people think of, like just don't seem to be there. So how do you reconcile, folks who think America is a Christian nation with America's racist past?
I think that analogy stands up. The same kind of logic that would say that Trump is a Christian in any meaningful sense of the word is probably similar logic to people who say the United States was founded as a Christian nation. It is a convenient myth. It is a useful myth that they can use and employ. And that's the key right here, is when when they say Christian nation, what do they mean? Well, there's a sense in which it's true if you're saying Christianity was present at the founding, a majority of the population has adhered to the Christian religion. And so you can say it's played a prominent role in our nation's history. I don't think even pro-democracy people should shy away from that. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of liberal or left-leaning people who haven't given religion enough attention in the political sphere or the history of the nation. But that is a far cry from saying that God has specially blessed the United States over and above all others, that the laws of this nation should reflect distinctly Christian principles, by which these folks mean a fundamentalist, conservative kind of Christianity. There's other Christianities that don't count, like what Black Christians practice or progressive Christians practice. And it's a far cry from saying, as some are today, that essentially you should have a religious test. You should be Christian in order to participate, certainly at a leadership level, in government. So we're saying a couple different things when we say Christian nation. It's important to be precise, but usually when it comes up in today's discourse, it's something that we should reject, both historically and in principle.
Yeah. So I got two little boys. They're 10 and 12, and my 12-year-old is, learning about American history and racism and all that other kind of stuff. And mind you, like if for those listeners at home, like I'm a Black person, so my kids are Black too. So they're learning about racism and are sort of compartmentalizing it, probably just through the way that they're being taught, that it was a problem back then.
Yeah.
like it wasn't, it's not a problem today. And just over the weekend, we were having a conversation. And I made a comment. We were talking about the N word and kind of like, like when to use it, when not to use it. Right. and,
Nice.
and I told him, yeah, your dad has been called the N word like multiple times. And he's like, by other Black people? I was like, well, yeah, but also like out Black people in a very aggressive, like, I don't like you way. And the look on his face was like that still exists? Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, it does exist. So I'm curious, like when we think about racism in the country, we tend to think of it like a political problem, a societal problem. I don't think we rarely ever think about it as like a religious problem. And I love
Mm.
kind of help make that more real for us on the complicity of, kind of the American church in racism.
So when we separate uh, race and religion, race as a political problem, not a spiritual problem, generally speaking, we're talking about the empowered people who make that separation, and the disempowered people that's never been a real issue. So in the context of race in the United States, we're talking about white Christians saying that race is political, and Black Christians understanding that, yeah, race is political and it's religious and it needs to be addressed both in the church and in the state. So it's convenient when you are part of the group that is empowered racially to say that it's a political issue, because then you don't have to talk about it in church, which is what happened. So there was a case that I talk about in The Color of Compromise, where Virginia Baptists had actually written a statement that was anti-slavery, and then they sent it out to the individual congregations, basically for input, feedback, reception. And that's when the wealthy plantation owners were like, whoa, 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 hey, what's going on here? We can't do that. And then what happened was, not only did they reject it, they gave a cause for rejecting it. They said that matters of slaveholding, whether it's right or wrong or what should we do about it, that was political and therefore outside of the scope of the church. It couldn't be addressed. Now, they could address everything from who was sleeping with who to whether you were tithing to if your dog was barking too loud. They addressed that in the church. But when it came to the most consequential economic and social institution, they're like, oh, hands off, can't touch it. And that's not just a problem of the 18th century. You can trace this throughout U.S. history, I would argue, all on up to today. Certainly in the civil rights movement, when they're talking about segregation, they're saying, first of all, these demonstrators and marchers and activists, they are breaking the law. We need law and order. And then they're also saying that you can't force people to interact. You can't force Black and white people together. That's a matter of the heart, which is kind of spiritual. But then they're saying they're using it as an excuse not to get involved politically either. And then even on up to today, I'm constantly sounding the refrain that pastors should be talking about voting rights. They should be talking about the crumbling of democracy. They should be talking about the mythologizing and the propagandizing going on around the 250th anniversary. And many still wipe their hands of it and say, that's political. I just preach the gospel.
Yeah. But why is that? I mean, it's, so when we talk to Michael Emerson, who wrote a wonderful book, Religion of Whiteness, I think he offers some answers to that, but I'd love to just kind of get your thoughts. Like, what is the sort of hesitation from religious leaders that you think makes it so difficult for them to, really want to speak out? I mean, I don't think it's the Johnson Amendment,
Right.
but it's got to be something else, I'm sure.
Well, first of all, it's hypocritical because they do talk about politics. When you want to talk about abortion, when you want to talk about sexuality, they will be absolutely vociferous from the pulpit and adamant. So they pick and choose the issues that they categorize as political. That's a choice. It's not written in the Bible what is a political issue or not. These are choices that individuals and religious communities are making about which topics they can address from the pulpit or officially from the church and not. So let's at least get off the table that they are not being political. They are, just in different areas. The reason why race has always been a red line for people is because it has to do with money, it has to do with power. And there's a lot of fear out there. So let's just say there's a group of faith leaders who completely agree with what's happening from the White House and from the far right. They agree with it. They are champions of it. They are cheerleaders of it. So there's that group. I would argue that's not a majority, but I would say there is a much bigger slice of faith leaders and Christians who are afraid to speak up. So particularly faith leaders, they're afraid to lose members. They're afraid of conflict. They're afraid of division, which the Bible has a lot to say about fear and who to fear, and has a lot to say about courage, right? That's the other thing, too. I've been talking a lot lately about how the fact that, the issues that we call political, they're really in the Bible. So actually, all you got to do is preach and teach the Bible, and you're going to cover these topics. Why? Because the Bible has a lot to say about oppressors. That's not woke language from the 21st century. It's in the Old Testament. That is a specific word. It has a lot to say about the poor. It has a lot to say about kings and power. And the fact that Jesus comes and says, I represent the kingdom of God versus the empire of Caesar. That is political. That is a clash, a monumental conflict of power. So, it's disingenuous because they're trying to avoid losing something: people, money, power. And it's a tale as old as the nation.
Yeah. So Josh normally handles a lot of the religious questions because I clearly don't read my Bible enough. I mean, he reads. but from what I know about the Bible, there are a lot of verses, passages that would seem like would make a good case against racism. Yet the church's complicity in racism seem to kind of argue otherwise. Like, help me understand, like, how is it that a church, Christian organization, over time, and I'm sure the churches have evolved in their thinking as well, but like, how is it that they can look at the Bible, read certain passages that say, hey, treating people as property is bad, but still go about, supporting, I don't know, promoting it, what have you?
Well, I think you have a better understanding of the Bible than a lot of people who claim to read it religiously. So there's that. But here's the thing. You can make the Bible say whatever you want it to say. And people have, and people do. So people made the Bible pro-slavery. This was all over the religious aspect of the Civil War, where you had Christians in the North and Christians in the South in a battle, not with bullets, but a battle over the Bible and interpretations of it. So in the South, pro-slavery, they would say, well, the Bible never actually explicitly condemns slavery. Instead, it regulates it. So it must be okay. Never mind the fact that the Bible did not have in mind race-based chattel slavery as was being practiced in the United States. And then the North, Christians in the North who were anti-slavery were saying, well, what about love your neighbor as yourself? What about all of the teachings of Jesus, like the Sermon on the Mount? How does that reconcile with enslaving people? Which, by the way, we use that term, but there is a lived reality to it. So what it meant was that mothers would look at their daughters with a blend of love and sorrow, knowing that when they reached a certain age, they would probably be sexually assaulted by the plantation owner. It meant that family ties were only as strong as the whims or the bottom line of the plantation owner, because a parent or a child could be sold off, never to be seen again. It meant that human beings with full intellectual capacity were prevented from reading, from writing, from learning about the world that God created and told us to steward. So when I say enslavement, it's not just this theoretical, hypothetical reality. It is an all-encompassing, oppressive system people were forced into from birth until death, which was an innovation of Western race-based chattel slavery. This was not indentured servitude. This was not something that generally you could get out of. You had any prospect of getting out of. So I just want people to sit with that visceral reality and then say, well, Christians are saying the Bible says this is okay. And they come up with things like the curse of Ham. It's a story out of Genesis, which says there's a verse that says, cursed be Canaan. And so I don't know how you get to curse of Ham from cursed be Canaan, but basically they say the descendants, the actual literal genealogical descendants are African. And it says, cursed be Canaan, he'll be a servant to his brothers, meaning he'll be enslaved. So if Africans are the descendants of this cursed group, then they, by God's ruling, are sentenced to perpetual servitude to the brothers, which, just happen to be the genealogical descendants become Europeans. So they, by God's decree, are the owners and the masters, and on and on and on. There's a passage in Acts 17, which you got to do some hermeneutical gymnastics to get here. But it says, God determined the places where all people should live so that they would reach out and seek and find God. That's actually a passage about unity, the unity of the human race, the sort of similar spiritual state of us all, and God's universal care for all people. Segregationists used to say, well, if God determined the allotted places, then that means God was the original segregationist, is a phrase they actually use, that God was the original segregationist. So again, you can make the Bible say whatever you want it to say.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Women were vital to the history of American Christianity. But now growing numbers of women are quitting the church over misogyny, abuse, racism, homophobia, and the big banner that seems to connect it all, Christian nationalism. I'm Sarah Stancorp, and my new book, Damned If She Does, is about why millions of American women have quit church and what it means for the future. Keep listening at the end of this episode for an exclusive Faithful Politics sneak peek.
I think if there's probably one myth that seems very resonant in Christian circles, it's this idea of it's this idea of what motivated Christians to get into politics, right? Like we probably think, not you, but the collective we probably think that Christians got into politics after Roe versus Wade, came about. It just mobilized, Christians, and they came out in force. But I think that those that understand a little bit about history know that Christians became activated much earlier than the Roe decision, arguably maybe even Brown v. Board Education. So I'd love for you to kind of just give us kind of the history of what exactly motivated Christians to get into politics.
So you can just pick your era, right? Christians have always been in politics, and when it comes to white Christians, have always used politics as a tool for racism. So you can go back to Virginia in 1667 in the Virginia Assembly making a law about what to do with baptism when it came to certain groups of people. And so they made a law that said baptism would not emancipate an enslaved African, indigenous, or mixed race person. Because it was coming up, well, if we preach the gospel to these folks who we are exploiting their labor, what happens when they become brothers and sisters in Christ? Do we have to free them? And so the Virginia Assembly took it up, who, by the way, were all good, upstanding Anglican men. They're like, well, no, we're not going to mess with the bottom line like that. So we'll make a law that says, all right, missionaries, you can scratch that itch. Go ahead and preach to the enslaved. But when they get baptized, if they get baptized, they're going to remain enslaved. So the plantation owner doesn't have to worry. All right. Everybody happy? Let's go. That's what it was. And then, so if we jump to the 20th century, that's when we sort of think about the modern iterations of Christians in politics. And you're absolutely right to point out Brown v. Board. We're a couple generations past that now, although not that far. My father was born far long before Brown v. Board. So this is in living memory, right?
It's so true. And I don't mean to cut you off, but I was mentioning to somebody the other day that, my father was born in 1928. He lived through Jim Crow, and I'm like, and I'm the first born, not to have to live under.
Yes. It's wild. It's wild. And I keep coming back to voting rights because it's such a clear parallel to the civil rights movement. That is, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was, in a way, the crowning achievement of the civil rights movement. It was always the pursuit of Black people and marginalized people to have the vote because that was your voice in how you were governed, in how your communities functioned, right? And so we have folks like Chief Justice John Roberts, who as far back as the 1980s was saying, well, we've progressed far enough in race in America that we don't need the provisions of the voting rights. He's been on a 40-year crusade, and I do call it a crusade, to gut the Voting Rights Act, which he finally has done in 2026. But think about it. If you're saying that in 1980, it's only been 15 years since the Voting Rights Act. So 15 years ago from today is what, 2011? And it's like saying since 2011 to 2026, we've made so much progress on race that we no longer need any safeguards or protections, right? That is from the Obama presidency to the second Trump presidency. That's what's happened in 15 years. So yeah, time in some ways is a construct, and so much of it has to do with our perception. And our perception is that these things were so long ago when my own father lived in a pre-Brown v. Board world. And then, this is what I want to emphasize to people, because we have such short memories and we think of the past as like this different world and reality, when really it was all the same kind of people with all the same kind of sentiments that we have now. Brown v. Board was an absolute lightning bolt in the country. It was a catastrophe to segregationists and white supremacists, because now you have the highest court in the land saying, I got to associate with these Black people? I got to send my blonde-haired, blue-eyed white daughter to school with these Negro men? The horror. And they did not take it laying down. They mounted an organized defense of segregation. They called it, the ruling came down on a Monday, they called it Black Monday. And they came up with something called the Southern Manifesto, which was almost like a Project 2025 to oppose Brown v. Board. And they said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do something called massive resistance. If enough of us reject this law and disobey it, they won't be able to enforce it. And they put that out publicly. And that's what they pursued for decades. And that's why the civil rights movement was needed. And even after the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the far right, which is populated majority by Christians, continued this concerted effort to roll back any civil rights progress. So when did they get involved politically? They've always been involved politically, but there are certain triggers that galvanize the political movement into high points that we now think about and talk about.
Yeah. So I want to kind of switch gears just over like Bible reading and Bible reading access, especially to enslaved individuals. Because over the 250, year span of Americans' history, like who could read the Bible or who had access to the Bible, I think was closely kept or limited, probably just through education or availability. And in some situations, they even completely rewrote the entire Bible. I believe it's called like the Negro Bible. So I'd love for you just to kind of give us a little bit of the history of like the Bible kind of through the years, especially in the hands of Black people, and what sort of problems did Black folks have to access the Christian faith.
As we mentioned earlier, Black folks were not legally allowed to read and write for a long time in certain parts of the United States. So first of all, they couldn't access it. And then what they then knew about religion and God came filtered through the lens of enslavers or the approved people of enslavers, right? So here's one thing to understand is the plantation hierarchy meant not only that white wealthy men were at the top of that pyramid, if we think of the plantation as its own like self-contained society. They were at the very top, the pinnacle of power. And it meant not only that they governed the lives of everyone, including their white biological family as well as the people they enslaved, but they also viewed themselves as the spiritual patriarch of the plantation. Meaning that they took it on themselves to care for the spiritual well-being of everyone. Well, what did that mean for the enslaved? It meant that they only taught them a Bible that affirmed their enslavement. So they would talk about the curse of Ham, and they would talk about slaves obeying their masters. And they got a very distorted picture. But what's even more remarkable is that somehow enslaved Black people and Black people in other areas still heard the liberating message of the gospel. Somehow they knew there was more to the story than what the white man or the slaveholder was telling them. And so, of course, you get the hush arbors, where enslaved people, after working from camp to camp, as they say, from can't see in the morning to can't see at night, would then sneak out and go into the woods and worship. And sometimes they would have to hang wet blankets on the branches around them to muffle the sound. And they would be praying and they would be singing. And that was, in so many ways, the true church, not the big steeple church downtown where the enslaver felt comfortable. It was in the middle of the night with mosquitoes buzzing and crickets chirping and heat and humidity and you losing sleep, but you crying out to God. And so then when you finally get emancipation after the Civil War, what do Black people do? Well, immediately they go out and learn how to read and write. Why? Well, one, we are intellectual, creative beings. We want that stimulation. We want what's been denied to us. But so many, the purpose, their main motivation of literacy was so they could read the Bible for themselves. And these Bibles became family heirlooms. They became, precious artifacts within a family. And being able to read and write and interpret it for yourself now led to this flowering of majority Black churches. First time they had freedom to do so, and the first time they were able to have a literate leadership and congregation to interpret God's word for themselves. So it's massively important.
Yeah, I love to expand a little bit more on the Black church and the Black church experience, because I think you wrote in your book, and I'm going to butcher this, so apologies for trying to quote back to an author something that I read and I'm trying to remember. but I think that you wrote, the Black church exists because of the white church. I'm paraphrasing. And I'd love for you just to kind of like expand on that a little bit more. And I think you alluded a little bit to it, the fact that, they had to sort of meet in private because they couldn't meet in public and sort of the other worship spaces. So just help us understand, sort of the importance of the Black church, how it came out, and then what did it do for the Black community?
I wrote in The Color of Compromise, there would be no black church without racism in the white church. There would be no black church without racism in the white church. What I mean by that is there was not some great theological schism that led to majority white churches and majority black churches. It's not like they were arguing over the doctrine of the Trinity or homoousios or whatever it might be, right? What it was simple, that black people did not want to be treated as second-class citizens in the household of God. And you actually had, even prior to emancipation, good faith efforts of black people to try to participate in majority white Christian spaces, because really that's all there was at that point. And so you can go back to the founding of the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal. Richard Allen, he was actually part of St. George's Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, which was majority white. And actually the black portion of the congregation was growing due to his efforts and the leadership of other black people. But it was because the leadership at St. George's told them, you're sitting in a segregated section that's reserved for white people, and tried to pull them up off their knees as they were praying. That Allen then writes in his journal, we got up as a group and left, and they were never troubled with us again. So that wasn't some great, theological conclave that was formed and they couldn't agree and then they split. That was because of racism in the white church, that black people felt, well, we can't get a fair shake here. We've got to go form our own churches and denominations. And so that has continued to this day to where now there's an embedded culture and tradition of it. And I would still argue that we still need black churches today, not because of some idea of racial segregation and we don't like those people, but because black people are still experiencing such acute forms of racism in majority white churches. I think probably many of us can give our own stories of that, particularly around these flashpoints of the last 10, 15 years. Black Lives Matter. As we record this, yesterday was the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. I put up a very even-keeled post that essentially simply recounted what happened 6 years ago, because our memories are short, and then ended with a call like, recalling these facts should continue to fuel the fight for justice. Like, that was it. It was not nearly as controversial as I could be. If you saw the comments on that post, it would break your heart. You would not believe that after everything we've seen in the last 10 years or so, people could still be so vocally, proudly, confidently racist. It was disgusting. And I said as much. I did a screenshot and a green screen and went through those comments. But that's why. Like, those folks are in churches, a lot of them, Christian in their bio, right? That's why. You still need things like the black church, which are not meant to reinforce segregation, but to empower a people who have been told in various ways all their lives that they are less than, and to remind them that their lives matter.
So next week for this series, we are going to be talking to Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead about Christian nationalism. And I like every time I read something about Christian nationalism, especially written by those two folks or like Robbie Jones or whoever, there's always an element of racism that seems to be included in whatever, they're attributing Christian nationalist ideas to. So I'd love to just better understand like how is Christian nationalism just a continuation of white supremacy, or is Christian nationalism racist? I'd love to just kind of just hear your thoughts on that.
Well, this is why I always refer to it as white Christian nationalism. I say the white part out loud because in a fully realized white Christian nationalist vision, who's at the top? It continues to be white people, and to put a finer point on it, white men, and to put a finer point on it, white wealthy men, which sounds a lot like what was happening 250 years ago with the Declaration and all men created equal, really only including white wealthy men, right? So in a fully realized white Christian nationalist vision, that's what's happening again. And then you see it in all kinds of ways. You see this in, you kind of have to at least be paying attention, have to be thoughtful about, well, how can you call it white Christian nationalism when there are like Latinos and Black people who participate in it? How can it still be white? Well, you got to understand tokenization. You got to understand that they are not valuing people of a different race or ethnicity for the fullness of who they are. They're valuing them for the ability to deflect charges of racism. Well, if I can platform this Black person who's parroting all the same ideas, well, then you can't accuse me of racism. And this is what happens on the political scale and in the church and even on social media. If one more person sends me Thomas Sowell to go read and research, right? Because he's this right-wing thinker. He's now deceased, but he's Black. And so they're like, here you go. And I always say, well, it's funny that the I don't see colored people, I don't see race people, only are sending me resources from right-wing Black people. I thought you didn't see race. Why are you only talking about these right-wing figures who are Black? Well, clearly you must see race. So I always found that funny. But yeah, honestly, it's exhausting. Like the scholarship is all there. The history is all there. At the end of the day, people do not want to reckon with how deep the roots of racism goes. It implicates everyone. And particularly white people don't want to ever, I'll say some white people, some do. I would say most don't want to ever really reckon with the fact that there is something called white privilege. I know that phrase has been coded as woke or whatever, but all your life, your race has just greased the wheels. And people misunderstand white privilege and think that means your life doesn't have any hardship, trouble, or pain. That's not what white privilege means. It means that your race didn't add to that hardship, trouble, or pain.
That's real good. Well, Jemar, so far we've spoken a lot about, Christian complicity in racism through the years, but we also know that there were some really, really brave, I don't know if you want to call them justice warriors or people of faith who also resisted kind of the pull from, sticking to whatever's popular of the day. And I'd love for you to just help us understand who were some of these people, maybe just share some of the stories that you're familiar with.
I love that you drew attention to this because it's my latest book, The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. I open with the story of Myrlie Evers Williams. That name may sound familiar because in June of 1963, her husband, Medgar Evers, was assassinated in their driveway. And the National Park Service has done a wonderful job preserving the home. You can still see the bullet hole in the wall. And I encourage people to make a pilgrimage to Jackson and visit that home. Well, Myrlie Evers could have given up at that point, and she did move to California with her children, now a single mom raising kids after their father had been killed. But she also continued the struggle for justice. She becomes the chair of the board for the NAACP, kind of pulls it back from the brink of disrepute and bankruptcy in a lot of ways, is part of ongoing civil rights struggles for generations. And she was at the grand opening of the Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, Mississippi. So it's kind of a homecoming for her. And after the sort of ceremony of the grand opening, there was a small press conference that I was just graced to be part of. And there was a journalist that asked her, how does now, this was 2017 or so. How does now compare to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s in terms of race relations? And she said something very sobering. She said, well, I'm seeing things today that I thought I'd never see again. She's basically saying we're going backwards. The progress that we thought was guaranteed is being rolled back. But then she did something unexpected to me. Like, this is a woman who even then was in her 80s, and as we speak, she's still alive. She should be kicking back by the pool with a drink that has an umbrella, in her hand. But then she said, but there's something about the spirit of justice that raises up like a war horse, that horse that stands with its back sunk in, and then it hears the bell. I like to say it's the bell of freedom, and all of a sudden the back becomes straight, the neck becomes stiff, and you become determined all over again. And I sat back and I said, wow, how can this woman in her 9th decade of life, who has lost more for the cause of civil rights than many of us can ever contemplate, say that you become determined all over again, say that there's something about the spirit of justice? And that is why we cannot give up the struggle today. We owe Myrlie Evers our resilience. We owe people like Myrlie Evers our ongoing resistance to oppression. We owe this great cloud of historical witnesses the commitment to keep up the struggle for liberation. And so I write all about folks like that in the book. One of the people, there's so many people I could speak of. Coretta Scott King, who also endured the murder of her husband and kept up the struggle. Well, she was also integral in getting MLK Day passed. It took 15 years. They introduced the legislation within weeks of King's assassination in 1968, and consistently for a decade and a half brought it again and again and again to Congress. Not until the Reagan era, ironically, did it get passed, helped by Stevie Wonder and his song "Happy Birthday," right? But Coretta Scott King's part of that,
Just real quick question: did it ever get approved in Arizona? Because I remember the Public Enemy song. By the time.
I'm vaguely remembering that, and I think it did eventually, but long after every other state.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So, Jemar, you have been writing about, faith, race, American history for decades. Spent, a lot of your work just trying to just tell the truth about kind of where we are, what we're doing. We are recording this for our Church State 250 plus series. And yeah, one question I've been asking all of our guests is like, what does this moment mean to you personally? 250 years, we're kind of looking back, we're looking forward, and we're just trying to just feel the moment for where we are. I'd love to just get your thoughts.
It's a moment to reclaim patriotism, which is different than nationalism, right? Like, this nationalism says my country is the best above all the rest, and we should act and be treated as such. Patriotism says this is my home. I have affection for my home. But also that affection means I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to tell the truth about it because I love it. Not because I don't, but because I love it and I want it to be better. And so it's a chance for us to reclaim that kind of patriotism. Why should the U.S. flag these days symbolize far-right authoritarianism? That is not something that should be a universal, right? Like, they take the flag and co-opt it to mean what they want it to mean. What if we take the flag and reclaim it for democracy? And, what's funny is Black people have always recognized the shortcomings of this nation and have always fought to make it better. So we go back to the Declaration of Independence and the phrases from there. I really like the preamble of the Constitution, where it says, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. I think those two phrases, we the people and more perfect union, are the ball game. That's what we need to reclaim at the 250th. We the people, that's what democracy means. Demos means people. Kratos means power. It's people power. The people need to reclaim their power. Why? In order to form a more perfect union. That is aspirational language. That says we're not there. And we never will be there. We will never arrive as a nation that is perfectly equal and democratic. But we are always striving to form a more perfect union. And that's what the vision should be. That's what people who care about democracy and their neighbors should be saying, is like, we can become a better version of what this thing is supposed to be. And I'm going to take up the charge in my generation, in my community, and do my part to form a more perfect union, because I'm part of we the people. So it's a chance to do that. It's also a chance to correct the historical record. You know, series like this are part of doing that. But whenever they want to propagandize the past, it's also an opportunity for us to speak the truth about history and to say, well, actually, this is what happened. This is what went down. It's a chance to sharpen our memory and understand more clearly what this nation has been about and chart a positive path forward. So it's very consequential. My concern is people don't care enough. They won't do their homework. They won't learn the history. They will be acting as if this is business as usual, hoping that someone else, somewhere else votes the right way or has the march or has the speech and the tide will change. It will not. On one of my social media accounts on Blue Sky, my handle is simply, this is not, all caps, business as usual. Meaning we can't rely on the typical mechanisms. I mean, right now, they are breaking up congressional districts in order to dilute Black political power, which is as old as the nation yet again. So it's going to take actually extra effort on our part. It's going to take, in particular, the effort of people who have been disengaged, the people who didn't vote, the people who think that both parties are the same, the people who are in this state of sort of hopelessness or cynicism, that to get off the sidelines and to participate, because they have a plan that they are executing systematically and methodically, and it is rolling back the rights of everyone, and it's actually tanking this country. Even if all you care about is economics, it's horrific what is happening to the economy under this regime of grift. So there's all kinds of reasons to get involved. That's my main concern, is that people won't, because they're not paying attention or they don't think it'll work. And that would be admitting defeat before it even happens. So no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. So do something.
That is awesome, and what a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much, Jemar, for coming back on Faith of Politics. This has been great.
I appreciate your thoughtful questions. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and to our audience, hey, thanks again for stopping by and watching Church and State 250 Plus. Make sure you stick around and watch our future ones coming. And if you haven't, catch up on the older ones. And with that, make sure you keep our conversations not right or left. And we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye. Hey, welcome back to Faithful Politics, and for our brief little interview with the one and only Sarah Stancorp. How's it going, Sarah?
Good. It's going well. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, so at this year's Southern Baptist Convention, and I'm no expert, but I can read the news, they voted overwhelmingly to advance some sort of formal ban on churches with women pastors. And your book, Damned If She Does, looks at why women are leaving the church and what that means for the future of religion. So I'd love for you just to, maybe give us what's one story that helps explain how a decision like what happened at the SBC shouldn't really surprise anybody.
So when I had the idea to write this book probably over a decade ago, I thought it would be very contemporary and how now we're decades hence. And when I sat down to write the book, I realized I actually needed to start in the 1980s because a lot of the threads that became important in women's lives started then. And I know this mini interview may become part of a broader conversation on Christian nationalism. As I look at the way evangelicalism, how the Christian right has embedded itself with our politics and really turned into a Christian nationalist machine. A big piece of that is Christian patriarchy. The way women are oppressed within this system is kind of a model for oppression of all of us. So jumping back to the beginning of the book, I start with Danuta Soderman, who was a co-host of the 700 Club with Pat Robertson, and she was granted a bit of influence there. She could talk to the country. She could even preach sometimes. God forbid. But she also was bounded by certain rules. She could have this influence if she followed certain rules. And as soon as she didn't, as soon as she was a threat that Robertson needed to dispose of, she was gone. When I think about the SBC, and I think about just year after year, amendments like this come up, attempting to silence women after women have worked so hard to press SBC for reform on sex abuse. This is no coincidence. When I look at that trajectory, and there are still women in SBC, many are leaving, a lot of people have left SBC, I see women who are making some sort of compromise. And they're there, whether it's for comfort or community, or because they're too scared to leave and they know what they'll lose if they leave. They're making a deal, but they're eventually gonna lose. And I think that's the heartbreaking part of seeing what's happening now within that denomination. Is bad for the church. It certainly isn't good evangelism, but it's also so bad for women who, the longer they stay and tolerate being treated like this, it breaks them down. And eventually the only way to safety is to leave.
Wow. Well, your book, The End She Does, when does it come out and where can people buy it?
September 15th, and everywhere we can get a book, you can buy a book there. It's going to be a big publication day. A bunch of other big books are coming out then. So I'm hopeful September is going to be a good month for dialogue about faith in America, especially in our current political situation.
Yeah. And your website?
sarahstancorp.com.
That's easy. And I will make sure all of this is in the show notes. And thanks again, Sarah, for stopping by and telling us about your book.
Thank you.
Awesome.